So let's start with the cat, since I've got him here. And I know most of you guys started kind of in this area here and started with this muscle. This is tensor fascia latae. Okay, and this fascia that runs down is the fascia lata, which is literally just the broad fascia of the thigh. And what is a fascia anyways?
I don't tendon. Not tendon.
It's basically just a sheet of connective tissue. Okay. So I just wanted to make sure I actually defined that for you. So this is the fascia lata. And the tensor fascia lata is this muscle that inserts into the fascia latae and basically acts as primarily an abductor at the hip, also protractor, okay, since it's coming in front of the hip joint. And this fascia runs all the way down over here. And this is, I mentioned, this is the IT band in us, and often gets very strained when people are running or something. They get these kind of tears in the fascia lata, which is a strain. Okay. The muscle itself is a little bit V-shaped, where it inserts into there, and that's a little confusing. Okay. As long as we're here, let's just continue with the gluteal group, because technically the tensor fascia latae is part of the gluteal group of muscles. Okay, so the butt muscles. And they all kind of come over the top of the hip here. And right behind tensor fascia latae is this one. It's also kind of superficial. I've sort of removed it from its insertion, but that would be
Gluteus superficialis.
the gluteus superficialis. Okay. And this is also basically an abductor of the hip. If we flip that back, you can see deep to that, gluteus medius, also abductor of the hip. Gluteal muscles in general are abductors. And then if we cut through gluteus medius and look deep to it, there's another muscle down here, and that would be gluteus profundus. Okay. So put all those guys back. So those are all the gluteal muscles, the three things that are actually called gluteus plus tensor fascia latae. Okay. If we flip tensor fascia latae out of the way, there's another muscle in the cat that you see running along, coming really from pretty far up on the ilium, running down like this, and inserting down into this fascia over the front of the knee. Okay, and this muscle would be I know most of you guys have rabbits, but
Sartorius.
that's the sartorius. And sartor means tailor in Latin. Like, have you ever heard of someone in sartorial splendor? Like they're really well dressed? Okay. And this is the tailor's muscle, because in humans, this muscle comes from the crest of the ilium, crosses the front of the thigh, inserts into the distal inside part of the knee, medial part of the knee. And so when it acts, it basically protracts the thigh, flexes the knee, and laterally rotates the hip. And so it brings your leg into kind of a cross-legged position. And apparently tailors always used to sit on the ground sewing their stuff in a cross-legged position. So the tailor's muscle, sartorius. Okay. I just want to point it out right away because it's very confusing, because in the rabbit, the sartorius looks extremely different. In the rabbit, the sartorius is a little strap muscle that comes, rather than coming all the way off from the crest of the ilium, comes way far back here by the pubic symphysis and runs just right along the inner side of the thigh, like that. And that's the sartorius in the rabbit. And that, by far, is the biggest difference between cats and rabbits in these pelvic muscles, is the sartorius. Okay. So there's sartorius, and I'm going to just flip it back. And if we flip the sartorius back, we look on the front of the thigh, and there's a group of 4 muscles here that we're looking at on the front of the thigh. There's one on the medial side and one on the lateral side here. These are the vastus lateralis on the lateral side, and on the medial side,
Medialis.
vastus medialis. This one that runs right down the middle is the rectus femoris, okay, which literally means the straight muscle, rectus femoris, of the thigh, the straight muscle of the thigh. And then if we cut the rectus femoris, and it's very kind of round in cross-section, so it sort of stands out from all the vasti. Cut that and look deep to it. You see there's another muscle down underneath there, and that's the vastus intermedius. Can you see that at all?
A little bit.
See if I can. Wait, there's my scalpel. Right here. Do you see that? Okay. So that's vastus intermedius. And what's this group of four muscles called on the front of the thigh?
Quadriceps.
That's the quadriceps femoris, the four-headed muscle of the thigh. It's got four parts. Okay. Let's look here again, medially, and there we go. Match things up. Notice how when I transect muscles, I try to cut them right across the middle of their belly in such a way that I can match up the two cut ends. And that's generally the best idea, rather than cutting them off their origin or insertion and wondering where they used to attach. So there's, on the medial side of the thigh, this is kind of the most obvious thing you meet with right off, this guy here. This would be the gracilis. And in humans, it's a very thin, slender, graceful muscle. Is not so graceful in these guys. It's kind of big and flat. But that's the gracilis. It's arising here from the pelvic symphysis, inserting into this fascia over the shank. And what do you think the main action of gracilis is going to be?
Adduction. Adduction.
Adduction at the hip. Yep. Or adduction of the lower limb. Okay. It can actually also cause a little bit of flexion at the knee, but mostly adduction. Okay, so that's gracilis. Flip that back, and we look in here, and we can see the right muscles. Yes. I'm going to separate that out a little bit better. Okay. Here. You can see a bunch of muscles. These two muscles are part of the hamstrings group. Okay. This is semimembranosus. This is semitendinosus. Okay. And these are muscles that arise from the ischial tuberosity. Do you remember that? The sit bone, the back of the pelvis, and insert down into the shank, basically below the knee, into this fascia over the front of the shank. Okay. They act primarily to do what at the knee, do you think? Flex or extend? Just take a look.
Flex. Extend.
Extend.
Okay. Try that again.
Flex.
Flex, yes. Okay, just think if this pulls, it's going to do that. So that's flexion at the knee. Okay. So these flex at the knee, what about at the hip? Are they going to protract or retract?
No, retract.
I would agree. Retract. Okay. One thing that's really good to know is when you've got an animal and you're playing with it, if you do something like here, I'm going to protract the thigh and extend the knee. Notice how these muscles get very tight. Okay. That tells you that what they do in life, the action, is the opposite of that. It's what's going to cause them to get loose, because if they get shorter, that's going to take up that slack that you see when they get loose. So anything that makes the muscle slack is actually the action that they have in life. Does that make sense? Okay. So you can play a little bit with your animal. The cats, for some reason, seem to be a little more flexible than the rabbits. I'm not sure why that is. Okay, so semitendinosus, semimembranosus, part of the hamstrings group. Okay, there's three parts of the hamstrings group. These are the ones that are on the medial surface, more laterally. You see this big muscle here? This one? What's that? Anyone?
Bicep femoris.
Mm-hmm. That's the biceps femoris. And then here we can see, just kind of poking out here, a little bit of semitendinosus, and right there semimembranosus. Those three together are the hamstrings group. All have the same action. They're retracting the thigh and flexing the knee. Okay. And the biceps femoris is the one of the three that's lateral, where it attaches into the shank. The semitendinosus and semimembranosus are medial, where they come into the shank. Okay. So we're just kind of going down these and eliminating things. there's quadriceps, there's hamstrings. That leaves us this group of muscles kind of in here. Okay. Did you see okay, Kevin? I see you sort of.
Could you please see the caudal, which one are you on?
Oh, I'll come to the cauda-femoralis. Okay, I sort of left that out for now. We're back on the medial surface. Okay, and basically in here, there's this large muscle and then this small one that are the adductor muscles. And this is the adductor magnus et brevis, meaning it corresponds to both of those muscles in humans, the magnus and the brevis. Okay, and then this is adductor longus. And these muscles are arising from, basically from the pelvis, various parts of the pelvis, inserting into the femur, the back of the femur. Do you remember the linea aspera, that line on the back of the femur, on the caudal surface? That's where they attach or insert. And what do you think the action of the adductor muscles is? Adduction. Okay, is that a good question? Yeah. All right. Yeah, but there are adductors of the thigh at the hip joint. Okay. So there's adductor magnus et brevis, adductor longus, and then there's another little muscle that you'll see right in here. This guy right here. See that? And it starts with a P. Anyone?
Pernius.
Not peroneus, pectineus. That's the pectineus. Okay, and that's also an adductor muscle, okay, in action. Okay. Its origin a little different. Then last but not least, in this region here, there's a muscle that's a little hard to see. It's actually two muscles together that kind of comes down out of the abdomen. You can see it kind of poking out of the abdomen here. Stick a probe up there and running down towards the femur. Do you see that guy there?
No.
That's the one, iliopsoas, with a P. But the P is silent, so it's the iliopsoas. Do you see that?
No.
Okay. Right in here, this guy. Okay. And that's basically coming down. The iliacus comes from the inside of the ilium. The psoas major actually runs alongside on the ventral surface of the vertebrae. And in fact, if you are a meat eater, the psoas major is the filet mignon, or the pork tenderloin. It's that muscle that runs along the ventral side of the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae. And the two muscles come together here and run down and insert into the lesser trochanter of the femur. And this iliopsoas is really an important muscle as the major, or at least one of the major protractors of the thigh. Okay. All right. So we're almost done, I think, with the thigh muscles. There's one little guy, the cauda-femoralis, that Kevin was asking about quite rightly, and it's this little one here, right in front of biceps femoris. Okay. And it's actually quite a bit larger in the rabbit. So let's take a look at the rabbit real quick. See if I can figure out where we are on the rabbit. Aha. Okay, so here on the rabbit, this is biceps femoris. Okay. Here is tendinosus and membranosus, parts of the hamstrings. This is biceps. Here's cauda-femoralis in the rabbit. It's quite a bit larger. Okay. And it's kind of a strange muscle in that it's very meaty to begin with, and then it just thins out into almost nothing, and it's tendon. Okay. And that's primarily going to act as an abductor of the hip joint. And then as long as we're here, let's take a look at some other muscles on the rabbit, since we've sort of been looking at everything on the cat, and just make sure everything looks similar, which it does. So biceps femoris, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, cauda-femoralis. What about this guy here? What's that coming down? That's tensor fascia lati. Then right behind that, also part of the gluteal group, would be this one. Gluteus superficialis. Here's gluteus medius, and then we cut that deep to it, would be gluteus profundus. Okay. And then here you can see vastus lateralis, and actually the vastus intermedius kind of pokes through from beneath on the rabbit. We flip this over. You can see on the medial side here, again, the sartorius that we already identified. Here's that tensor fascia lati that is really quite large in these guys, coming over the front of the thigh. But then you can see this muscle coming straight down the front of the thigh. That would be rectus femoris again. And then here on the medial side, vastus medialis. Okay. Sartorius again. This thin one starts with a G.
Gracilis.
That's the gracilis. And if we flip that back, you can see here semitendinosus. Semimembranosus is not really quite separated out. Basically this guy here. Semitendinosus, semimembranosus. This is the adductor magnus et brevis, adductor longus. The little one that starts with a P is pectineus, right here. Is that okay? And then the iliopsoas in these guys also can be seen kind of coming out here underneath the sartorius. There's a little bit of it there, but it's probably more easily seen down in here, running down to the limb. So you see this guy right way down deep in there. That's the iliopsoas. Okay.
Can you turn it on a little?
Right in there. All right. Did I leave anything out? Are we good?
What is it that the iliopsoas does again?
The iliopsoas is a protractor of the thigh. Okay, so then we come down to the muscles of the shank. Okay, where are they? On this side. Okay. And there's not a lot I asked you to learn here, but there's just a few. Basically, on the front of the shank, there's a muscle that's the primary extensor of the ankle, or dorsiflexor of the foot, as we call it in humans. And that's the tibialis cranialis, and it's this muscle right here. It's a big muscle on the front of the shank. That's the muscle that in us, if you go running and you just get those horrible pains in your shin, you get basically shin splints. Those are tears in the connective tissue of that muscle. It's really important. It's kind of a cool thing. A moment, yeah. When you're running, this is the muscle that when your heel hits the ground controls the descent of your foot down. So it's actually contracting to keep your foot from just slapping onto the ground. So it's what's called a lengthening contraction, which is confusing to us anatomists. Physiologists are all about them. But basically, if you think about it, you're running along, your heel hits, you're kind of rolling forward onto the foot. The foot is descending gradually, and that tibialis cranialis is controlling that. But it's because of that it easily gets tears in the connective tissue. Okay. So that's tibialis cranialis, in humans, tibialis anterior. And then on the back side of the shank, there's a muscle called the gastrocnemius. We saw it already in a frog. It's this guy right here. And that arises by two heads from the distal femur. It joins with another muscle that's deep to it right here. That's called the soleus, because it looks like a flat fish, like a sole in a human. It's a little flat muscle. And those three muscles join together, the two heads of the gastrocnemius and the soleus, to come into the Achilles tendon here that then inserts into the calcaneus. And that's the main flexor of the ankle joint, okay, which is the main muscle involved in propulsive stroke. Generally pretty well-developed muscle there on the backside. Okay. Yeah, and I think that is it. Okay, good. So then we have a little bit more. So we did have some muscles up here that we haven't looked at yet. And on the cat, I don't believe we've really gotten there yet. No, but fortunately this rabbit, they are go-getters. You guys got to this on your rabbit. So let's take a look at just a few muscles here. Basically, the muscles we have to look at are the hypobranchial muscles and the branchiomeric muscles of the mandibular and hyoid arches. Okay. And can't quite see all of them, but we can see most of them here pretty well. So hypobranchial muscles, remember, are going to be the muscles that are involved in coming between the sternum and the inside of the lower jaw, running in this region. And the most prominent ones you'll see are a pair of muscles that come from the sternum and run up to the hyoid bone, and those are called the sternohyoids. And that's this guy here. Okay. Those basically are involved in pulling the hyoid down, which is retracting the tongue. So if the hyoid gets pulled back or caudally, that's pulling the tongue back into the mouth. Okay. If we flip these back, the sternohyoids, you can see the hyoid itself, the hyoid bone, is up right in this region. You can see where they're attaching, right in there. Okay. And below that is this big cartilaginous structure, and this is the larynx or voice box, and we'll get to that when we get to the respiratory system. But I just want to tell you the big cartilage of the larynx, the one that is in us is the Adam's apple that sticks out, is called the thyroid cartilage. So it's not the thyroid gland, it's just in the same general vicinity. Thyroid in Latin means shield, and so it's a shield-shaped cartilage. And there's a muscle that runs from the sternum to the thyroid cartilage right here. And that, come back here, that muscle here is called the I need an extra hand, the sternothyroid muscle. So it's this little guy. And it's deep to sternohyoid and a little bit lateral. So that's from the sternum to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. And then if you follow up with your probe, you'll feel that it sort of stops. It attaches to the thyroid cartilage. And there's another little muscle that starts right at that same point and runs all the way up then from the thyroid to the hyoid bone. The thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. And that would be called the thyrohyoid, exactly, muscle. So there's a sternohyoid, sternothyroid, and thyrohyoid, which sounds horrible, but they're all just named for what they attach to, origin insertion. So if you remember that, then that really helps with those muscles. Okay, let's put this back. If we look down here then, in the throat region, you see these two big bulging things here. Those are the jaw muscles. In particular, that's the masseter muscle, which is the main muscle that closes the jaws, particularly in herbivores, really well developed. So like this rabbit, big jaw muscle on the cheek. And it's coming off the zygomatic arch, originating there, and inserting down into the mandible, near the angle of the mandible. Chomp, chomp. Okay, so those are these guys. In between the two masseters, you can see a pair of muscles that are running up like this, inside the rami of the lower jaw. Okay. And those are the digastrics. And digastric means literally two bellies, digastric. And in humans, this muscle has an anterior belly that's derived from mandibular arch musculature and a posterior belly that's derived from hyoid arch musculature, and a little tendon in between. In these guys, there is not really a posterior digastric. There's just the tendon. There's the anterior digastric that shows up pretty well right there. And this muscle is originating off the back of the skull, off the occipital region of the skull, kind of wrapping down around inside the lower jaw, and pulls back. It is basically the main jaw opening muscle in mammals. That's this guy here. And then in between the two digastrics, running across the throat, is another little muscle, and that's the mylohyoid, M-Y-L-O, mylohyoid. And this is pretty much comparable to the intermandibularis that we saw already in Necturus and in sharks. Fibers running across, basically lifting up the floor of the mouth. It's homologous. It's part of the mandibular arch, branchiomeric musculature. Okay. And if we flip that back, and it's a very thin layer, you'll see another muscle deep to it that's running from the inside of the lower jaw back to the hyoid, and that is the geniohyoid. Okay. And that's this little guy here. And deep to that, running up into the tongue, is genioglossus, which we looked for in Necturus, and it was very unimpressive. It's actually quite a bit more impressive in these guys, but really hard to see because it's kind of up into the tongue. And we'll see it later when we actually get somebody to get brave and cut the head of their rabbit or cat in half and look at the two halves, and we'll get a good view of that. Okay. So that's what does that belong to, by the way? The geniohyoid, which group of muscles?
Hypobranchial muscle?
Hypobranchial. So that's the last of the hypobranchial muscles. There's one other muscle that we're not going to see well because the top of the head has not been skinned off in this rabbit or cat. That's the temporalis, and that's the one that comes off the temporal fossa and arises there. It has fibers that extend down under the zygomatic arch through that gap created below the zygomatic arch, and insert onto the coronoid process of the mandible. And again, part of the jaw closing musculature, temporalis and masseter are the main jaw closing muscles. And that one is much better developed in carnivores. So the cat has a pretty good temporalis, the rabbit has a very small one. Okay. The other facial musculature, the hyoid arch muscles, are not really easily seen on these guys. There's the platysma, which is this thin sheet across the throat, corresponding to the sphincter coli that we saw in the Necturus. And there's all the rest of the facial musculature that allows them to do things like smile, since your rabbit and cat always smile. Basically to move the skin on the face, and that's all hyoid arch musculature. That's a unique mammalian feature, by the way. You probably know this, but we alone among all vertebrates really have the ability to move our faces and make expressions because of this hyoid arch musculature that migrates into the face. So, okay, we good? That's all the muscles.